Charles was 6 years old when Philip sat him at the table. "Being a prince means control," he had said coldly. "Emotion is weakness. Authority is earned through respect." Little Charles's eyes had filled with tears, but Philip had continued. "Tears are unacceptable. Strong leaders use emotional manipulation. They don't become emotional." That day, Charles had received the most important lesson of his life: how to use love as a weapon. Years later, the foundation for the systematic control techniques he applied to Diana was laid that day. But Philip also had a teacher, the Queen Mother, and she had one too, the Victorian emotional suppression tradition. Charles was just the final link in a learned behavior chain. Who had taught him to systematically break Diana? This was the dark story of psychological warfare techniques perfected in the royal family over generations. In 1954, 6-year-old Charles was crying as he walked through the cold corridors of Windsor Castle. His nanny Margaret had been cruel, scolding him for showing emotional attachment. When Philip found Charles in this state, his reaction was immediate. "Stop crying immediately," Philip had said with a harsh tone. "Princes do not cry. Princes do not show weakness." When Charles's sobbing continued, Philip used a cold strategy. "If you continue this emotional display, you'll eat dinner alone tonight and tomorrow night until you learn proper control." This was Charles's first lesson. Emotions are punished with isolation. Philip sat Charles in his study and began systematic education. "Royal leadership," he said, "and it means controlling others before they control you. Emotion makes you vulnerable. People exploit vulnerability, so we eliminate emotion." Charles was confused. "But Mama shows emotion." Philip was stern. "Your mother has a different role. Queens can show selective emotion for public sympathy. Princes must show strength. Different rules, different training." Charles learned. Emotional expression had gender-specific rules. Manipulation tactics were role-dependent. Philip continued teaching. "You control people through their needs. Everyone needs approval, acceptance, love. You provide these things conditionally. When they behave correctly, you give approval. When they don't, you withdraw." 6-year-old Charles. That sounds mean. Philip was cold. That's survival. That's leadership. That's how the royal system works. Charles didn't yet know that Philip's own training had been much harsher. Philip's childhood in Germany had been brutal. Father absent, mother emotionally distant, boarding schools with harsh discipline. Philip learned early. Emotional attachment was a liability. Control was a survival mechanism. In the 1930s, teenage Philip had watched family members lose power when they showed weakness. Emotional expression created political vulnerability. So Philip developed his strategy. Emotional suppression plus strategic manipulation equals survival. When Philip married Elizabeth, these techniques were perfect. He had integrated them into the royal system. Emotional control became family tradition. But Philip's teacher had been more sophisticated. The Queen Mother. The Queen Mother, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, was a master at manipulation. But her methods were subtle, refined, aristocratic. Instead of Philip's harsh directness, she used psychological finesse. Charles would watch the Queen Mother in action. How she controlled situations without appearing controlling. How she influenced decisions without direct commands. How she managed people's emotions while appearing caring. "Darling Charles," the Queen Mother would say sweetly, "strong people help weak people become better. Sometimes helping feels like being strict. But it's love, really. Charles was confused by this message because the Queen Mother's approach seemed different from Philip's. But the result was the same: emotional control. The Queen Mother taught through example. When someone disappoints you, you don't shout. You become sad. You let them feel guilty for hurting you. Guilt is more powerful than anger. Charles observed this technique countless times. The Queen Mother would use a disappointed expression, gentle sighs, subtle withdrawal of warmth. People would scramble to please her, to regain her approval. "See how effective," the Queen Mother would explain privately. "No harsh words needed. People control themselves when they fear losing your love." When Charles was sent to boarding school at age 8, sophisticated training continued. Gordonstoun School was a harsh environment. Philip deliberately chose this school because it taught character building through hardship. But the real lesson was different: survival techniques. Older boys taught Charles unwritten rules. Don't show fear, show control. Don't ask for help, offer help to others. Don't appear weak, appear stronger than you feel. Charles learned vulnerability was an invitation for attack. Strength meant making others dependent on you. At school, Charles observed the effective boys, not the physically strongest, but the emotionally controlling ones. They created hierarchies through psychological manipulation, not physical force. James, a senior boy, taught Charles an important lesson. Control comes through making people need your approval. Be unpredictable with kindness, sometimes warm, sometimes cold. You keep them guessing. Charles practiced this technique on younger boys. Kind one day, distant the next day, creating emotional dependency. Another lesson from Henry, a prefect. Make people feel special when they please you. Make them feel ignored when they don't. Never explain why. Let them figure out what you want. Charles learned emotional uncertainty created submission. The most important lesson from school: authority doesn't come from position alone. It comes from psychological dominance. People must want your approval more than they want independence. But what was truly shocking was that Charles's systematic manipulation training was a core part of aristocratic British culture. Aristocratic British families had developed emotional control systems over centuries. And this wasn't Charles-specific training. This was class-specific conditioning. Upper-class British culture taught emotional suppression as a virtue. The stiff upper lip philosophy meant emotions were private, controlled, strategic. Children were taught early. Emotional display was a sign of weakness. Strong people controlled their emotions and other people's emotions too. This system created emotionally sophisticated but emotionally cold individuals. People who understood psychological manipulation intimately but couldn't access genuine emotional connection. During Charles's university years, training continued through social observation. At Cambridge, he watched how upper-class social dynamics worked. Aristocratic relationships were transactional. Love, friendship, loyalty, all conditional, all strategic. Though people formed connections based on utility, maintained them through psychological management. Charles learned advanced techniques: cultural superiority as a weapon, intellectual intimidation, social embarrassment as punishment, isolation tactics, economic control. These weren't taught directly, they were absorbed through cultural immersion. Charles observed how successful aristocrats managed their wives through cultural control, social positioning, financial dependence, psychological superiority. Wives need guidance, older aristocrats would say. They need education, refinement, proper direction. Men provide this through firm but loving control. Charles learned control disguised as care was acceptable in aristocratic culture. At university, Charles practiced these techniques in relationships. Not consciously cruel, but unconsciously controlling. Making girlfriends dependent on his approval, using withdrawal as punishment, cultural superiority as a weapon. These relationships were short-lived because women sensed the manipulation and left. Charles interpreted their departures as evidence they weren't suitable for royal life. Real training completion came with the Camilla relationship. Camilla, with her aristocratic background, knew the same manipulation techniques, but she used them differently. She made Charles dependent on her approval, not vice versa. This relationship dynamic taught Charles an important lesson. When both people use manipulation techniques, the relationship becomes a power struggle. Charles learned he needed to be more skilled, more subtle, more controlling. With Camilla, our Charles learned advanced emotional warfare. How to use guilt effectively. How to create emotional dependency. How to maintain the upper hand while appearing vulnerable. Camilla was a master at emotional manipulation. She taught Charles unconsciously how to use intermittent reinforcement, how to create addiction to your approval, how to maintain mystery while controlling information. Charles observed how Camilla controlled him. Sometimes available, sometimes distant. Sometimes adoring, sometimes critical. Creating emotional uncertainty that made him desperate for her consistency. This, Charles realized, is a powerful technique. The person never knows where they stand, always working for approval, never secure enough to demand equality. When the relationship ended due to royal obligations, Charles was devastated. But he learned a crucial lesson. Emotional control techniques work both ways. You need to be more skillful than your target. This was exactly when everything changed. Because when he met Diana, Charles found the perfect opportunity to systematically apply all his learned manipulation techniques. Diana was young, inexperienced, emotionally open. The perfect target for sophisticated psychological manipulation. Charles could use all his learned techniques without resistance. First, Charles applied the Queen Mother's strategy. Cultural superiority disguised as help. Diana needs education, Charles convinced himself. She needs guidance, refinement, proper direction. I'm helping her become suitable. This justified all controlling behavior as beneficial. Second, Charles used Philip's approach. Emotional suppression enforced through isolation. When Diana showed emotions Charles disapproved of, withdrawal of approval followed. Inappropriate emotional display was punished through coldness. Third, Charles applied boarding school techniques. Unpredictable approval creating dependency. Sometimes warm and loving with Diana, sometimes cold and critical, creating emotional uncertainty that made Diana desperate for consistency. Fourth, Charles used aristocratic methods, cultural intimidation and social positioning, making Diana feel intellectually inferior through constant education, using royal duties to justify control, social isolation from inappropriate influences. All these techniques were refined over generations, perfected through practice, justified through culture. Charles wasn't consciously malicious. He was applying learned behavior patterns that seemed normal, appropriate, even helpful from his perspective. Diana's resistance shocked Charles because his previous training hadn't prepared him for strong emotional pushback. Aristocratic women typically submitted to these control methods. Diana's American-influenced independence, emotional directness, refusal to accept cultural superiority, all were foreign to Charles's experience. Charles escalated his techniques because the initial methods were ineffective. He applied all learned strategies simultaneously: systematic cultural bombardment, social isolation, emotional punishment, psychological intimidation. This campaign nearly succeeded. Diana was almost broken by the sophisticated manipulation inherited from generations of royal psychological warfare. But Diana's inner strength, modern influences, and supportive friendships helped her recognize and resist the systematic control. You haven't seen the biggest surprise yet. Because Charles's systematic manipulation training wasn't just applied to Diana, but was also transmitted to his own children. During William and Harry's childhoods, they absorbed the same lessons from their father, to different degrees, in different ways, but the fundamental patterns were transmitted. William learned early: emotions must be controlled. Royal duty was more important than feelings. Public image was priority over private happiness. Harry learned: compliance brought approval. Rebellion brought punishment. Love was conditional. Both children watched their parents' marriage deteriorate through psychological warfare. Both internalized lessons about relationships, control, emotional expression. William, and as the elder son, received more pressure. He was taught explicitly: a future king must control emotions, situations, people. Weakness will not be tolerated. Harry, as the spare, was under different pressure but received similar lessons. Support your brother. Don't overshadow. Control your natural impulses. Both children learned manipulation techniques through observation: how to use guilt, how to withdraw approval, how to create emotional dependency. But there was a critical difference: Diana's influence. After Diana recognized the manipulation, she began teaching her children different lessons: emotional honesty, genuine connection, unconditional love. Love shouldn't hurt, Diana told her children. Love doesn't require perfect behavior. A love doesn't control or punish. This created conflict in the boys' minds: father's approach versus mother's approach, control versus connection, traditional versus modern. William, as the dutiful son, more readily absorbed his father's techniques. But Diana's lessons were also internalized. This created internal conflict. Harry, as the rebellious son, preferred his mother's approach. He valued emotional honesty and genuine connection. Years later, these childhood lessons would play out in their adult relationships. William, in his relationship with Catherine, initially displayed some control patterns. But Catherine's strength, Diana's lessons, and conscious effort helped him modify his behavior. Harry, in relationships, preferred emotional openness. He rejected his father's techniques. He chose his mother's emotional honesty. Both learned: generational patterns can be changed. Manipulation techniques don't have to be transmitted. But this required conscious effort, self-awareness, commitment to emotional health. Charles, in later years, developed some self-reflection. He realized the damage caused by systematic manipulation. But changing deeply ingrained patterns was difficult. With Camilla, in his second marriage, both people understood manipulation games. The relationship was more equal because both were skilled in psychological tactics. Neither was completely dominated. Wait a minute. Don't miss this detail. Because Charles's manipulation training wasn't just an individual family issue, but was the psychological foundation of the entire British aristocratic system, the royal family's manipulation techniques were representative of broader aristocratic culture. Centuries of class-based psychological control systems. The aristocracy maintained power not just through wealth and position, but through sophisticated emotional control of family members, staff, and social networks. These techniques were taught generation after generation: emotional suppression, psychological intimidation, cultural superiority, social positioning, economic control. Upper-class British culture, historians noted, was psychologically sophisticated but emotionally impoverished. People were trained in manipulation but incapable of genuine intimacy. Charles represented the perfect product of this system. Highly skilled in psychological control, completely unprepared for genuine emotional connection, and Diana represented a challenge to this system. Modern emotional directness, American-influenced independence, refusal to accept manipulation as normal. Their marriage was a clash between two psychological systems: traditional control-based relationship versus modern connection-based relationship. Charles's manipulation techniques, refined over centuries, met modern emotional awareness. Old system versus new understanding. Diana's resistance represented cultural evolution, rejection of manipulation as acceptable relationship dynamic. Her victory over Charles's systematic control was symbolic of broader cultural change. Emotional health valued over social control. The modern royal family learned from the Charles-Diana disaster. William, Harry, and the next generation were taught different lessons. Emotional intelligence was valued. Manipulation techniques were rejected. Genuine connection was prioritized. But scars remained. Charles's training left a permanent mark. Trust was damaged. Intimacy was compromised. Relationships were forever affected. Understanding Charles's manipulation training doesn't excuse his behavior. It explains origins, provides context, but doesn't justify psychological warfare against a spouse. Many people experience similar training: emotional suppression, control-based relationships, manipulation as normal. Most don't systematically destroy their spouse's spirit. Charles's choice to escalate techniques when Diana resisted revealed a character flaw beyond learned behavior. His willingness to break another person for control showed moral failure. Now you've seen nothing. Maybe because the modern relevance of Charles's manipulation training is incredibly powerful. Many people are still raised with similar techniques, still applying learned psychological control patterns. Modern society still teaches emotional suppression, still rewards control over connection, still justifies manipulation as help or guidance. Parents use cultural superiority, emotional withdrawal, approval conditioning to control children. Partners use systematic psychological pressure, social isolation, reality distortion to maintain power. Institutions use authority abuse, intellectual intimidation, cultural programming to prevent rebellion. Charles's techniques are ancient, but their applications are modern. Recognizing these patterns is crucial for psychological health. Understanding how manipulation is taught, transmitted, and justified helps people identify and resist similar control attempts. Diana's resistance provided a template. Trust your emotional reality. Maintain supportive connections, refuse to accept control as love, demand genuine respect. Modern relationships can learn from Diana's experience. Sophisticated manipulation is often disguised as care, education, improvement. Real love doesn't require breaking someone's spirit to remake them. Charles's training revealed how psychological control systems perpetuate through generations. Breaking these cycles requires conscious effort, emotional awareness, commitment to healthy relationship dynamics. Understanding doesn't excuse, but knowledge empowers. Recognizing manipulation sources helps people choose different approaches, teach different lessons, create different legacies. You won't believe it, But Charles's manipulation training story isn't just a royal family tragedy, but also a universal warning about how psychological control techniques are learned, transmitted, and ultimately challenged. Every generation has a choice. Repeat learned patterns or choose healthier approaches. Charles chose repetition. Diana chose resistance. William chose modification. Harry chose rejection. Modern families face the same choice. Traditional control methods or emotional connection, manipulation techniques or genuine intimacy, power over others or power with others. Charles's training showed the darkest possibilities of psychological education. Diana's resistance showed the brightest possibilities of emotional evolution. Together, their story provides a complete lesson. Control destroys connection. Manipulation eliminates intimacy, but conscious choice can break generational cycles. Understanding how Charles learned manipulation doesn't diminish Diana's courage in resisting it. Knowledge of sources doesn't excuse choices, but awareness helps. Recognize patterns, resist repetition, choose connection, teach health. The royal family learned. Society is learning. Each generation can choose better. Charles's manipulation training ended with Diana's resistance and wisdom. An evolution from control to connection. A transformation from manipulation to authenticity. From generational repetition to conscious choice. A freedom lesson for modern relationships. The dark history of Charles's training. The bright legacy of Diana's resistance. The power of pattern breaking. The possibility of love conquering control. This is the wise end of a perfect modern psychology lesson. And so Charles's manipulation training story comes to an end. A journey from generational trauma to conscious choice. An evolution from learned behavior to emotional intelligence. A transformation from control systems to connection culture. A freedom inspiration for modern families. The warning of Charles's dark education. The empowerment of Diana's resistance. The possibility of cycle breaking. The hope of the next generation.